Welcome back to our class. This is Lecture 2, Part 1. And let's go back to looking at what we had talked about in our last session. And you recall we had left off in the book of Numbers in chapter 35 with regard to the sixth commandment that we find in Exodus chapter 20 in verse 13, where the word of God says to us, "You shall not murder." Lo tazar, which is murder, and not lo rasa, which is to kill. In many of the popular translations, we do discover that it says, "Thou shalt not kill," but that is not the rendering. It is, "You shall not murder." And you recall we had left off in Numbers chapter 35. So let's return there to Numbers chapter 35. Now, the biblical requirement is unequivocal, and it is for this reason that the biblical law denies a court or other human institution the authority to pardon a murderer or to commune the death penalty into ransom as clearly stipulated in the injunction. Now, let me explain what that means. You recall that what we've been doing here for the last several classes is looking at the sages of old, the Jewish wise men, the Hebrew scholars of old during the period of the Talmud and the Midrash, because this gives us the necessary foundational background to understanding the commandments. Now, as we look at that, this is one of the things that we have to consider. At least in the modern era that we're living in, and at least in our country that we're living in, at least here in the United States, all 50 governors, and we have 50 states plus the President of the United States, they've been given the authority by law, human law, that the President of the United States has the ability to commune or pardon a criminal if he so chooses to do so. So does the 50 governors. Every state has a governor. They have that authority and they have that power. Now, it's used mostly for political reasons, and in some cases, they're able to pardon people who were unjustly prosecuted. And I think that's a good thing. However, by and large, to commune somebody who's been found guilty and proven to be guilty, okay, is clearly contrary to the word of God and the command of God. We find that here in Numbers in chapter 35. Note what it says here in verse 31. "Moreover, you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death." Now, I want you to see what it's saying. Moreover, you shall not take ransom in our modern era. You shall not take a donation from a political contributor. You follow me? For the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. And what do we find today? We have a lot of that going on, which is a direct violation of the scriptures and the commands of God. However, the text hastens to clarify the competent witnesses must attest to the guilt of an alleged murderer, and the murderer shall be slain at the mouth of witnesses, but one witness shall not testify against any person that he died. Now, I want you to note this. And it's really important, because in order to accuse somebody of having violated the sixth commandment, "You shall not murder," the act of murder, the law, biblical law, require at least two witnesses. The biblical concern for justice is thus not only reflected in the demand that society avenge the murdered, but also that the alleged murder not be subjected to any miscarriage of justice caused by false witnesses. Accordingly, it requires that there be two corroborating witnesses, and Jewish jurisprudence sets forth a process for the interrogation of witnesses designed to assure that the testimony they give is valid and corroborated, and at the same time preclude collusion. So what would happen was that on the Jewish jurisprudence, okay, Two witnesses will be separated immediately. They will be interviewed separately, completely, and never allowed to come in contact with each other in order to avoid collusion. And they wanted to make sure that both people were saying the same thing about the same person, about the same act, and in this case, the taking of a life, what we will call murder. Okay? This would ensure that, in fact, this was the murderer, and it would ensure that the murdered individual would be avenged and justice would be brought. Okay? Also, it would ensure that the murderer has rights as well, that he would not be, or the person being accused of murder would not be falsely accused of something and put to death. That process is in place under this thou shalt not murder. Now, I want to also draw your attention to Numbers chapter 35 and look at verse 30. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death. And notice what it says, at the evidence of witnesses. Note the word, at the evidence of witnesses, not hearsay. But no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. It required at least two witnesses. Now, in the modern era in which you and I live, okay, in which you and I find ourselves, not only do we have witnesses, verbal witnesses, personal eyewitnesses to an event, but we also now have DNA, we have fingerprints, we have all kinds of other technology that can prove without a shadow of doubt the presence of a person at the scene of a murder, etc., etc., etc. So now we have enhanced the ability to do this much more so today. In the Judaic jurisprudence system, okay, and tradition, here's what the commandment says. And listen to this very, very carefully. Thou shalt not murder has been understood to encompass, notice the rest, illicit killing, both by hand and by mouth, and would thus include providing false testimony that led to the execution of an innocent person, as well as the case in which a person is in possession of information which, if revealed, might save another person's life but fails to do so. So what we have here is that if someone falsely testifies and the person is executed, that person is guilty of murder. If a person withholds information, okay, that would shed light on the case that's being brought forth before the court here, okay, and the person is executed, you are now accused of murder. So you need to understand thou shalt not murder does not only involve the actual person who committed the act of murder, but if your silence or your speaking up leads to the wrongful death of an accused person, okay, you are also guilty of violating this command, you shall not murder. The prohibition is also held to apply to a variety of other misdeeds short of felonious murder, but that are nonetheless considered illicit bloodshed. Thus, the rape of a betrothed woman is considered equivalent to murder. So if you rape a woman who is engaged to be married, okay, in this particular case, okay, you have committed the act of murder. Look what he says in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 6. 22, verse 26. Forgive me. It says verse 26. Deuteronomy 22, 26. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. For just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is in this case. So she is a victim. She is a victim, okay? And it says, just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, he who commits a rape in this particular case, he had shed blood of this woman because it was assumed that she was a virgin, okay? And he's going to shed blood, all right? And so now he is guilty of murder and he receives a death sentence. Now, the Hebrew scholars of old, the Jewish wise men, the sages of old, also considered a person who causes another's death by preventing the supply of food and water as though he had killed him. Now, listen to this carefully, because many of us sit in the church very smugged, okay? You cannot accuse me of murder. We have people who are starving and dying all over the world for lack of food and water, and we have the resources, the wherewithal, and we sit in the churches smug with our arms crossed, praising the Lord, so forth and so forth. And the scriptures also teaches us that you are just as guilty having the ability to prevent that and not to do anything. Now let's go back and begin to look at this in light of our society today. You shall not murder. You will not murder. Lo tesar, okay, as opposed to thou shalt not kill. And I want you to draw your attention to this in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13. Now, as we look at these introductory remarks, I want to draw your attention that murder, lawlessness, and violence are sweeping the earth at an incredible rate today. Hundreds of thousands of people are being murdered and slaughtered year after year throughout the world. The value of human life is almost worthless in some societies, and clearly in the society that you and I find ourselves, life has become worthless, so cheap that people have no qualms in taking the life of another human being. Two things. Society after society considers human beings, even young children, to be nothing more than chattel property, laborers existing only for the ruling class and the wealthy. That continues today. And society after society allows the constant barrage of violence and lawlessness to be shown in films and other media, shown even to small children, despite the undeniable impression printed upon the human mind and its terrible consequences. People have become so desensitized and hardened to lawlessness, violence, and killing that the front pages of our newspapers and news reports of television and radio are usually filled with all of these terrible crimes, which is why I waste very little time with it anymore. In addition to the entertainment industry, television, movies, and video games, and music, and books, and magazine focuses upon lawlessness, violence, and killing, as well as immorality. It sells. And the reason it sells is because we purchase it. Yes, I'm also addressing the church here. The point is this: life is pictured as cheap by both the media and the entertainment industry of society. The mind of a person is bombarded by the act after act after act of lawlessness, violence, and killing every day of his life. If he reads the newspaper, watches television, listens to the radio, or picks up a magazine, it's always present before that person. Okay? And that is the lawlessness and the act of violence and the maiming and killing of people, that to him, life no longer is valued whatsoever. Think about what has just been said. Every day of a person's life is filled with the images and thoughts of lawlessness and violence and killing. If he reads the newspaper, watches television, listens to the radio, or picks up the magazine, it doesn't matter. It's a daily barrage of this. No wonder we have become so desensitized and hardened to violence and murder. No wonder that has happened. No wonder life is so cheap and means so little to so many people. No wonder so many have become lawless and violent themselves. No wonder there are so many assaults and killings. We just see and hear so much about violence and killing every day of our lives that it is now common in our experience, and it does not trouble our spirits whatsoever. This is the important subject of this commandment, a commandment so desperately needed today. The commandment 6 concerns man's life to never murder. It is the sanctity of human life. So we're going to hang our hats on 3 major points we're going to be looking at in this 6th commandment. Okay? Number 1, who is to obey this commandment, and how long was this commandment to be enforced? We see that here in verse 13. And then number 2, what is forbidden by this commandment? And we see that here in verse 13. And number 3, what is the decision required by this commandment? I want you to understand that society at large is clearly guilty of this, but so is the church. And when I say the church, I'm talking about many, many believers who sit in churches all over our country and around the world, and you're raising your children by the television set because that has become your favorite babysitter. And all they're exposed to is nothing but violence after violence after violence after violence, as well as the movies and the books, and look at the horrific video games. And we would have no qualms whatsoever of spending hundreds and thousands of dollars in these games, where the child becomes so desensitized to the value of human life, and we celebrate it. And I'm speaking inside the Christian community, the so-called Christian community, and we have now so devalued the life of human beings, so desensitized it, okay, that we have no qualms whatsoever, and then we find ways of justifying it, and then we cross our arms as though our hands are clean, and we have people all over the world who are literally dying and starving, okay, of thirst and food, for lack of food and lack of water, and we have the resources, but we will instead spend hundreds and thousands of dollars in our Christmas shopping to buy the latest, most violent game, during the birthday of a child to buy them the most violent and latest game that's out there, so that he or she is raised so completely desensitized to the value of human life, and it really doesn't trouble us whatsoever. Something is profoundly wrong. In fact, at home, the news gets about 5 minutes of my attention on a daily basis, and that's about it. Other than that, I just don't watch it anymore. Much of what I used to watch, I just don't watch it anymore. And I don't know what's happened to me, other than the fact that most people think I'm crazy, and that's another issue for another day. But the fact of the matter is that what's happened is that I'm becoming more and more sensitive that this is wrong. It's just plain wrong. But we will invest money and spend hundreds and thousands of dollars in the biggest television screens possibly that we can get, and we want to get the highest definition in 3D and what all that language is. I don't understand all the technology behind it, okay? So we can be more graphic and we can see the violence of it. And life is so desensitized, so devalued in the eyes of many that are in the church. I'm never concerned about the world. I'm never concerned about the devil. They're going to do what they're going to do. It's the life of the church that has been so culturalized, so desensitized to this insanity. So we've come so far down this road that to go one step further of violating "you shall not murder" is an easy step to cross over and justify. And yet we're told that, the industry will argue with you, the television industry, the news media industry, the movie industry will argue with you, the books and the magazines and the video games will argue with you. That is not true. That is not true that we desensitize people's value systems. And why they do that? Because they want the money. They want the money. And we're just stupid enough to believe it because we also want to purchase it. See, both sides got the same problem. It's about money. They want the product, in spite of the fact that it leads us down a road, okay, of self-destruction and of violating God's image on this earth. We're thrilled by the idea of maiming and killing other people. We're thrilled by it. We have so become desensitized ourselves that it doesn't trouble us that the image of God Himself, because man was made in the image of God, is being destroyed. It doesn't trouble us whatsoever. So I want you to see that with me. Let's look at this first step, or this first point. Who is to obey this commandment, and how long was this commandment to be enforced? We're told here in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, you shall not murder, you shall not murder, lo tazar, okay? Was it only to govern Israel and the ancient world? Only? And it was, you hear this argument all the time that this is only applicable to Israel, the Ten Commandments, and only to the ancient world, thus is no longer applicable to us because the church has now pretty much embraced the culture. Now what we have today is a lot of cultural churches that are just simply not scriptural churches. And there's a profound difference between being cultural and scriptural. But today we would rather be cultural rather than scriptural because scriptural by and large has a standard way much too high than we're willing to pay the price for. So that's the question that we must answer. Right? And we'll see it. Was it only to govern Israel and the ancient world? And that's really what we have to look at and find out. Is it true? Right? When he says here that you shall not commit murder. Right? Well, what do you do with it? Because this same commandment is given to us in the New Testament in a different setting. Okay? Now, was murder and lawlessness and violence only a problem in the ancient world? Really? Only then and not today? Where you can walk down the streets of any city, any state today in our country, and murder is a regular business now today? And the answer is obvious. One of the most terrible social ills down through history has been murder and the lawlessness and the violence that surround murder. God gave this commandment to govern civilization and the societies of every generation of man. God gave this commandment to make communities and streets safe, our homes and our businesses secure. That's why God gave it. Now, when you look at this in Exodus chapter 20, and we're given this commandment, and I want you to see this with me in verse 13, you shall not murder. Okay? Look with me just briefly at Exodus chapter 21, verse 12. Exodus chapter 21, verse 12. Look what it says. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. And yet, we want to pray for our babies and ask for plead and for mercy of God, asking God to violate his own command. And yet I understand, I hear the argument all the time, well, that was old, it's antiquated law, that was given to the Jews, not to us, and so forth and so forth, and it really is not applicable to us today. Well, if that is true, then go with me to 1 John, please. Go to 1 John and look at me in verse 15. 1 John, go to the Old New Testament, please, and just look there with me briefly in 1 John, because I want you to see this with me. All right, because it really is crucial that we begin to get a handle on this so we understand how it gets restated in the New Testament. So look at this in 1 John chapter 3. And it says here in verse, if I recall correctly, it should be verse 15. And it says it this way. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has an eternal life abiding in him. Hating your brother is an act of murder in the eyes of God. Welcome back to our class. This is lecture number 2, part 2. And let's return back to our outline. Now, we were looking at this commandment, the 6th commandment, you shall not murder, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, lo tazar. And if you recall, under the last point that we were discussing in the class, we were looking at who was to obey this commandment and how long was this commandment to be enforced. We said that what we had said was that was it only governed to Israel in the ancient world? And that's the question that we were asking, because that is the traditional argument that you hear a lot in the church. In fact, you hear it in the church, never mind in the world. Right? And that is that, well, this was only given to Israel, to the Jews during the ancient times. All right? And now let me ask you something. Was murder and lawlessness and violence only a problem in the ancient world? Now, we need to use a little bit of logic here. Is it true? Well, if that is true, then what's with the crime rate in our society today? It's off the top of the charts. It's past the charts. It's out of the roof. The number of murders that take place. And they have all these statistics that they'll show you, but for every 100,000 people, there's 5.5 people killed, 6.9 people killed, 7.9 people killed, and so forth, okay? For every 100,000 people. Do you understand that we live in a country of 312 million people? Do you understand the murder rate is astronomical in our country? So, the question, was it only to govern Israel and the ancient world? The answer must be obvious. One of the most terrible social ills down through history has been murder and the lawlessness and the violence that surrounds murder. God gave this commandment to govern civilization, the societies of every generation of man. God gave this commandment to make communities and the streets safe, our homes and our businesses secure. That is clear. However, what we have is now today a society that wants to explain away all of the social ills, thus by justifying the reason why people murder and so forth and so forth and so forth and so forth. And what we have is that we have these revolving doors in institutions where people are going in and out for murder all the time and continue to wreak havoc and mayhem upon society simply because we violate this command, and as well as the execution and all of the implications that is involved with this command. Now, question is, who is to keep the commandment? Now, I want you to notice this. In the Hebrew text, this is lo tezar, okay? In the Hebrew, it says, you shall not murder. This is the sixth commandment. Now, I want you to notice, it says you. Okay? The commandment is forceful. It is directed to you personally and to every person upon this earth. You cannot duck your head as they do in church, and hopefully it's talking to the guy behind you. No, it is speaking to you, to every single person on earth. You, my friend, you who is listening to me right now in this class, who is watching me right now in this class, and those of you who are tuning in by way of video. This, God is speaking to every single one of you. Every single one of us. Not one of us can escape the reality of this truth. The commandment is forceful. It is directed to you personally, to every person upon this earth. You shall not murder. The motives and the emotions that arouse a person to murder, the desires, the passions, the greed, the anger, the wrath, the revenge, are all but to be put down and controlled. Every single one of these issues is controllable in the life of a person. You, all of us, are responsible to obey this commandment. You are to control your anger, your passions, and your greed of your flesh when they are in fact aroused. God has given you the capacity to do so. You are to obey the sixth commandment of God. You shall not murder. And yet what we have is social workers and psychologists and everybody else in between trying to explain why this young person, this young man, why this individual took the life of another person. And they begin to explain to you all of the cultural, social background of this individual and everything that's ever happened to him or her in their life. And as a result of that, we are now to take that into account and justify the taking of a life. Yet, that is quite cultural, albeit, but none of it is scriptural. Either we submit to a scriptural standard, that is to God the Father, or we do not. And what we have today in the church, in much of the church world, is a complete aberration, a complete disregard for the law of God under the guise and under the misunderstanding of what grace is. In the second question that we have to answer, what is actually forbidden by this commandment? When he says, lo tesar, it does not say you shall not kill. It says you shall not murder. So what exactly is included in this commandment? And if you recall, in some of our classes some time ago, we began to make a distinction between all these categories. He says you shall not murder. So how is his commandment broken or violated? You go, well, that's a dumb question. That should be a relatively easy question to answer. Or perhaps not. Before actually looking at what the commandment forbids, note why God gave the commandment. Let's look at this. Number one. Now, the purpose for this commandment is to preserve life. That's the reason why the commandment is given. See, every coin, in order for it to be legal tender, a coin it must have two sides. There's a front side and a back side. Okay? Now, you shall not murder is the back side of this coin. The front side of this coin is for the preservation of life. Life is precious. God is the author of life. God is the giver of life. God is the creator of life. God is the source of life. Life is His and His alone. Now we are the beneficiaries, okay, of that life. So we have a responsibility to administer that life. Thus, we're not allowed to take it, to step on it, and abuse it, and use it. I want you to understand that. So the purpose of this commandment is to do what? It is to preserve life. To teach people that the sanctity of human life, that they are to honor and hold human life in the most highest esteem possible. Yet, in a highly technical, well-educated society such as ours, quote unquote, we are barbarians when it comes to life. And much of it has to do with because we are a greedy people. Capitalism now drives our holy decisions. And because we are such good capitalists, okay, we allow the lawlessness to take place on our television screens. Excuse me. Excuse me. It is now ruling our lives to the extent that what has taken place now is that it now rules the television sets, the media screens, the movie screens, and so forth, our video games, because it's business. It's just business. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to declare to you, it is not just business. It's not. The purpose for this commandment is to preserve life. And in this process, we had this long discussion in our last class while people are being desensitized and life is being reduced to absolutely nothing, simply to dollars and cents. Man is created in the image and the likeness of God. Therefore, man's life is of infinite value to God. And that's probably the issue that most people struggle with. You see, you have infinite value to God. The reason why we have so finite value, so little value to each other, is because we no longer hold God in high esteem. We no longer do that. And we forget that He is the creator. He is the source of life. So since we devalue who He is in our lives, we can devalue the representation and the image of that life. Therefore, man's life is of infinite value to God. Now look at this. Let's go back to the very, very beginning of this. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. Look at this with me. And don't forget what we're talking about. We're talking about the sixth commandment, you shall not murder, here in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13. Now, go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and look at this with me, please, in verse 26 and 27. Then God said, stop there. This is God. This is God's declaration, right, of who will subject the world that He's created. Now remember, God created the whole world. He created the plant, He created the plant life, the animal life. He created the atmospherics, everything in it. And now He places and He creates a federal headship, someone who will now rule in His place as His representative over all of the creation. And he says here in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and then God said. So now when God says this is his decretive law, he has declared this to be so. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. So he makes man, he creates man according to his virtues. We now have the capacity and the wherewithal to appreciate, not only in the physical sense life, but we have the capacity to communicate with God and God to communicate with us in spirit, soul, and body, and to embody what his decretive law is. What his decretive law is. Now look at this. Let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let now man do what? Man is going to rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth, right? And over every creeping thing that creeps in the earth. Now man is given federal headship not only over human beings, but over all of creation. That's how valuable and important this person is to God. You are to God. I am to God. We are to God. Infinite value. God created man in verse 27 in his own image. He did not make him in the image. In other words, human beings, we are not the image of something else that would come up in his mind. We are the image of who he is. He says here, created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So I need you to understand something. 4 things. Man is God's master creation. If you are awed, completely taken back how awesome God has created the heavens and the earth. I've had people who go to Arizona to the Grand Canyons and they just sit there mesmerized and they look at the creation and go, wow, what an awesome God. Or they go to the sequoias, to the trees, and they go up to Northern California and they go up to the forest and they see the magnitude and the immense size of all this forest and they just sit there and wonder. Or they go and they look at the mountains. My wife loves to look at the mountains. You know, my wife is completely nuts about looking at the mountains, okay? And she gets even nuttier about watching the ocean and the sea and the beach. And she's just taken back and awed by God's creation. And you see that wonderful moon and you see the sunset and so forth and so forth. And I can appreciate all that. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. And yet, the very same people who are awed by all of God's creation have such little value about the federal headship of that creation, human life. That doesn't add up in my head. That's 1 + 1. Okay? Should be 2. But when I listen to people speak, it's 1 + 1 is 11. It does not add up. Man is God's master creation. That's it. You are God's master creation. Nothing else in creation has the ability to hear God's voice, intelligently respond to God's voice, commune with him intelligently and spiritually. We have. See, creation reacts instinctively to God's voice, but we rationally, intelligently, and spiritually commune with God's voice. It's a tremendous, we are God's masterpiece. B, we are God's royal masterpiece. Royal masterpiece. We're at the top of the food chain, if you will. We are the best of the best. I know that's pretty frightening when you look around your room right now. But you are. You are royals. You are God's royal masterpiece. C, you are God's precious, precious possession. You are the most precious thing that God has. I need you to just to try to see if you can conceive of this. When God sent his son, Jesus the Christ, to die on the cross for man's salvation, that's you, and that's you, and that's you. Okay? Question. Did he send him to die for those awesome mountains? Did he send him to die for that awesome sun? Did he send him to die for that awesome sunset? Did he send him to die for those awesome sequoia trees? Did he send him to die for that awesome Grand Canyon? Those hillsides, those fields, did he send him to die for that? No. In fact, I want you to think about this just for a moment with me. And I know that for everybody who's trying to save the planet, you're about to get upset at me. I get that. I understand that. But just think about it. Did he send him to die for this planet? Did he send him to die for the whales? Did he send him to die for the dolphins? Did he send him to die for the toad rat? Did he send him to die for anything else you can conceive of? No. If you would be honest, and I trust that you will, and you say you believe in God and you believe in his word and you believe in the scriptures, which is a representation of God's person, then you must arrive at the same conclusion as I have, and that is this. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever, that's a human being made in his image, should not perish, but have everlasting life. So God sent his son to die, okay, for his master creation, for his royal masterpiece, and for his precious possession, which is another human being. Why? Because we're told in Genesis chapter 1, this is what we're told in verse 26 and 27. Let us make man, see, the master's precious possession, in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds in the sky, and the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man. God created what? His precious possession in his own image, and in that image, he created what? His precious possession, male and female, he created them. He's precious. And fourth, point D. Man is God's priceless property. Just think about that for a moment with me. Just think about it for a moment. Man is God's priceless property. You hear what I just said? Priceless property. Does this make a little bit more sense why we have the 6th commandment, you shall not murder? Because it is priceless property to God. Now think about this for a moment. Not only did God send his son to die for man and man alone, okay, but in the end of time, in our eschatology, and in our comprehension, in our eschatological understanding, okay, of the end times, God's going to get rid of this entire earth. Everything is going to be burned up. And it says there will be a new heaven and a new earth. So while you're so busy trying to save that which he's already declared that he's going to destroy, and now you understand why man is his priceless possession, because he declares that he's taking man with him to be in paradise forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Now do you understand why we, men and women, we understand that, of course, okay? We're God's master creation. We're God's royal masterpiece. We're God's precious possession, and we're God's priceless property. We belong to God. Why is man so highly esteemed? As stated, because man is created in the image and the likeness of God. God demands that human life be valued above all the wealth in the world. He says in Matthew 16:26, he says, for what will it profit a man for if he gains the whole world and forfeits what? His soul. Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? In Mark 8:36, he says, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? The sanctity of human life is to be honored above all else. That's why, again, he says in Genesis 1:26 and 27, God, let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds in the sky, and over the cattle. And he says, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on earth. God created man in his own image, in the image of God. He created him, male and female. He created them. In Genesis chapter 9, he says this in verse 5, 6, and 7. He says, surely I will require your lifeblood from every beast, and I will require it, and from every man's brother, I will require the lifeblood of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by his blood shall he be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And for you be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly, and multiply in him. Again, now what is forbidden by this commandment? Point 2, you shall not murder. The Hebrew word for kill or killing, rasad, okay, as we understand it, and how modern guys have translated, but it's really the word tasad. It means premeditated, planned, deliberate, intentional, unauthorized murder. This commandment is broken either by a planned, murdered attack upon a person or persons, or by a rash and reckless attack. It does not matter. It results the same. The commandment forbids the taking of a life because a person is angry, because a person is bitter, because a person is violent, because a person is uncontrolled, because a person is lusting, because a person is coveting, because a person is passionate, because a person is vengeful, because a person is selfish, because a person is stealing, because a person is rebelling. Murder for such reasons as these is wrong and must always be counted wrong. This is the only way to make our community and our society and civilization safe and secure. The terrifying evils of this earth, lawless violence and murder, must not be allowed or tolerated in our society. We must always agree with God's holy word. Murder for such reasons as anger and robbery and violence must always be counted wrong and be punished. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot violate this command.